All right, so we're going to look at the causes of World War I. Now, we can summarize the causes of World War I using 4 general causes. Okay, there are 4 main causes for World War I. And we use the acronym MAIN, M-A-I-N. So to start with, our first cause of World War I is militarism. Now, militarism is the buildup of the military. Okay, so what we see is that European nations had large armies. Okay, huge amounts of armies, right? It was the thing to do. Germany had a huge army, right, left over from Bismarck's building up of the military, from unification from the time of the Franco-Prussian War. Britain had a large army and a large navy. France was building their navy. Russia was building their army, right, and it had started way back in the 1600s, right, and the 1700s with Peter the Great, right, when he modernized their military. Okay, Russia just kept growing their military. So by now, most of the major European powers have large armies. And remember, not long ago, 100 years ago, not quite 100 years ago, by the time of the start of World War I, European nations were already battled with the Napoleonic Wars. Right? And of course, we have the colonial wars that fought. So most European nations, the most powerful nations, already had large armies, right, left over from previous wars. Now, the problem is that what's going to happen is that if one country mobilized or prepared for war, then others would start to mobilize. Okay, so mobilization efforts began to take place near the turn of the century. And so we start to see that European nations are going to start to create large armies and have them ready for war. Because, again, left over from the imperialistic era here that we're still in, you got to be ready to fight. Okay, and so, they have large standing armies at their disposal, which typically was not the way history worked, right? That's just not the way things work. It may seem odd to us, Jay, right? Because here in the United States, right, we have our army that's ready, right? All we got to do is say, go fight this war, and they're ready. But many nations didn't have that back then, right? So you had to mobilize or prepare them. And so we do see a lot of mobilization efforts happening around 1900. Cause number 2, alliances. Alliances divided Europe into competing camps. So basically, the alliances, what we see is, and there are 2 versions of the alliances, because some countries kind of changed their alliances, but essentially Europe is going to be divided into 2 groups. Okay, and so you have one group of nations, and this is how it was around 1900, right? We have Britain, France, and Russia, that's in the purple here. This was one alliance system, the Triple Entente. So they pledged that they're going to be allies, they're going to be friends, right? And then you also have in the red Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, which was another alliance, the Triple Alliance. And so these nations formed these alliances to help protect each other, right? Because Britain and France, particularly, and Russia did not like Germany and Austria-Hungary, right? They posed a threat to Russia, France, and Britain and their power and their grasp on the world. And so these European nations have these alliances that they're going to protect each other. Right, so this is a political cartoon from back in the day, and we see there are several countries represented here. Right, we have Serbia, which is a tiny little country. We have Austria. We have Russia. You have Germany. You have France. And in this guy back here, he doesn't have a name, but it would have been obvious to them back then. This is Britain. And so what happens is this kind of illustrates what happens with an alliance system like we had established by 1914. So the little guy here says, if you touch me, I'll, right? And then his friend Austria says, if you make a move, I'll. and then Russia gets involved if you hit that little feller Isle, and then Germany gets involved to tell Russia, if you strike my friend, then Isle, and France tells Germany, if you hit him, talking about Russia, Isle, and Britain says, hi there, if you don't, and then, talking to Germany, Austria, all right, and so basically they all rush to protect each other, right? It's in case of a fight or a war breaks out, right? And so if one of these, like in this case, Austria starts beating up on Serbia, or Russia's going to step in and beat Austria up to protect Serbia, right? And if Austria is going to fight Serbia, then France is going to get involved, because if Russia is beating up Austria, well, Germany is going to beat up Russia. And if Germany is beating up Russia, then France is going to beat up Germany for beating up Russia, who's beating up Austria for trying to beat up Serbia, right? And then France gets involved to beat up Germany, to beat up Russia, to beat up Austria, who's beating up Serbia, and Britain gets involved because Germany is fighting, and so on. And so it gets very tangled up. So eventually these alliances would cause diplomatic failures. So what we see is that instead of talking things out, and instead of trying to solve things peacefully, European nations would rather go to war. And so the alliances that were in place obligated each member to help the others if they were attacked, right? And so, for instance, go back here, if Austria was attacked, then Germany, by their alliance system, is supposed to help Austria defend itself. And same thing, Russia and France and Britain had a pact that if one of them gets beat up, like Germany is going to do to Russia, then France and Britain would have to step in. Right? That's what an alliance system does. And so if one is attacked, the rest have to step in and fight. Now, we have militarism, we had alliances. The third cause of World War I was imperialism. So imperialism, European nations competed for overseas colonies and created these huge empires with lots of wealth, right? And so what we see is that, remember, conflicts spilled over into the colonies. And because of industrialization, it was all about grabbing colonies. And so if we create these huge empires, then it's going to spread. The war would spread and conflicts would spread. And we're all looking for that edge, right? European nations are looking for a leg up, essentially. And so everybody's competing for these colonies. There's only so much to go around. And so fighting would happen because of these colonies, right? And industrialization. The fourth and the last cause is Slavic nationalism, or we can just say nationalism. So militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. Nationalism has to do mainly with Slavic nationalism. Now, what that means is, remember, we've already talked about nationalism. Nationalism is pride in your country. It's pride in who you are, your ethnicity, mostly. And the idea of nationalism said that we should not have these huge empires that just smush all kinds of different ethnicities and all kinds of people together. That's not what we should have, right? But that's the way Europe worked for the longest of times. Right? Austria-Hungary, for example, was a good example of that, right? When we did the Habsburgs, we talked about the Habsburgs had huge diversity, right, within their empire. Well, these Slavic people, which is an ethnic group, right? It's like saying you're Irish or Welsh or French or German, that type of thing. That's your ethnicity. Well, there's a group of people called the Slavs. And a lot of them lived within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was formed after the Congress of Vienna, right? And so, in order to keep that balance of power. So we have this huge empire here that covers a large part of what is Eastern Europe, and all the different colors represent a different ethnic group within the Austro-Hungarian Empire by 1910. And so these Slavic people represent part of the empire. But they're being ruled by people who are Austrian, which is more German than they would be like Slavic. And the Slavs weren't really allowed to have a say-so in their government. Even though it was supposed to be a dual empire, right, where you have the Austrians who are German, then you have Hungary, which aren't Slavic, they're not German, they're more like Mongolian, the Magyars. And so it was supposed to be a dual monarchy, basically two countries in one, but it didn't really work out. But the problem is a lot of this down in here, where it says Croatia, and what is now Croatia, what is now Bosnia, right? A lot of these places have Slavic people. And the problem is that they weren't getting a say-so in the government. Now, the Slavic people are more ethnically related to the Russians than they are to the Germans. But they're being forced into this huge empire run by Germans, the Austrians, who are ethnically like Austrian, which is similar to German, right? And so that's the problem. Because what happens is these Slavic people say that they want their own country. They want to have a Slavic independent country that's not part of this huge Austro-Hungarian empire. Well, that's not what Austria-Hungary wanted. And so they said no. And they were willing to put that down by force, the idea of rebellion. But the problem is that even though the Germans, the Austrians had told the Slavs that no, you can't have your own country, and you're still going to be part of our big conglomerate of all kinds of different people. Well, the thing is that over here is Russia. Russia and the Slavic people are allies. And so oftentimes they look to Russia, and Russia was considered like their guardian angel type of thing, right? They're supposed to be protecting the Slavic people. Austria didn't like that, and so that is going to cause problems. And so what happens is, this is a political cartoon that kind of shows what's happening. Right here we have the Balkans. That, remember, that's our peninsula where the Austro-Hungarian, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is, where your Slavs are. And each of these represent a different country that would represent Europe, the major powers of Europe, right? You have the German, you have the British guy, somebody is French, somebody would have been Russian, right? And the problem is that what we're going to see, all the troubles in the Balkans with Slavic nationalism is finally going to boil over, right? That's the point. So the final spark that ignited the war was the Serbian assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. On June 28, 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip. Now, Princip was a Serbian nationalist who did not like, he was basically part of this terrorist group, the Black Hand, and he did not like, he and his group did not like the Austrians. Now, the Archduke, who was the heir to the throne, the next in line to become the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, was supposed to be there, and he happened to be with his wife. They were supposed to be there on a goodwill tour to appease the people, to be nice to them, to show them that, you know, Austria does care about them. But it was already planned out. The Serbs had planned to assassinate the Duke, and they ended up succeeding. And so with this, basically, war is going to start.